Okay, welcome everybody. I hope everybody can hear me all right. And welcome back to the conference. I hope everybody's had a good time this morning with the first keynote speaker and the workshop sessions, and that you are refreshed and ready to go for this afternoon. For those of you for whom it is the afternoon, of course, we have different people in different places, and so you're all very welcome. It's good to see some familiar faces here, but for those who don't know me, my name is Richard Saunders Hindley, and I am Academic Director at Cliff College. We are a partner college along with Nazarene Theological College with the University of Manchester, and we've been involved with NTC in the planning of this conference. It's my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker for this session, Dr. Autumn Olcott Ridenour. Dr. Ridenour is Associate Professor in the Department of Religious and Theological Studies at Merrimack College in North Andover, Massachusetts in the USA. She's the author of Sabbath Rest as Vocation, Aging Toward Death, published by T&T Clark in 2018. And she's also written several articles and book chapters for edited volumes that include Christian Bioethics, the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, and the Hastings Center Report. Her current research considers the technology of digital devices and the significance of presence for the relationships, and moral agency. Her paper this afternoon is entitled Aging as Vocation, Moving Towards Sabbath Rest. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ridenour for our paper this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Steve, and to all the organizers of this conference. It's a true honor to participate with you. Good afternoon to you. Good morning here from the United States. I've already enjoyed hearing from Anthony Reddy and look forward to hearing from others, as I hope this will be an enriching conversation, both between the Q&A and the different workshops. So again, thank you. Are we measuring time, or is time measuring us? This appears to be the fundamental question at the heart of human aging. Tech writer Nicholas Carr describes the impact resulting from the invention of the modern clock and its ability to assess time with the illusion of control. Control, efficiency, and productivity are the values most associated with the capitalistic spirit in the modern West, with far-reaching impacts given connections through a global economy. With headlines announcing the rising tide of the global silver tsunami predating the COVID-19 pandemic, economists have issued a warning of greater social dependence associated with statistically higher aging populations. Foreshadowing such change, Simone de Beauvoir's The Coming of Age in 1970 describes the onset of old age as worse than death itself. Individuals are viewed as objects or cultural anathemas, since productivity is the primary arbiter of value. Transhumanist voices challenge the natural process of aging further by treating it primarily as a disease to be cured. Geriatrician Louise Aronson highlights the tendency to marginalize the elderly, occupying merely the periphery of medical education, certainly in the United States, but also research priorities and focused care. Recently, this recognition has been vindicated through the multiple vulnerabilities of long-term care facilities amplified through the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of these questions and challenges cause us to reevaluate the value and meaning of aging and whether Christian theology might have something to offer this particular stage of life. Turning to resources within the Christian tradition, particularly the patristic theology of North African Bishop St. Augustine of Hippo, may offer some meaning for this stage of life as one of vocation through time, a theological vision of eternal Sabbath rest. I will discuss aging as vocation by first emphasizing Augustine's view on human life as one of growth and change through time, with the teleological aim of Sabbath rest. And second, by describing the significance of belonging in communion with God and others, along with the virtues possible for the aged and their surrounding community. So first, the purpose and meaning of aging, change through time directed at Sabbath rest. In Nicholas Carr's 2011 book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brain, he demonstrates ways that new technologies shape and change not only our culture, but our very sense of self. He says, quote, "What the map did for space translate a natural phenomena into an artificial and intellectual conception of that phenomenon. Another technology, the mechanical clock, did for time. For most of human history, people experienced time as a continuous cyclical flow. To the extent that time was kept, the keeping was done by instruments that emphasized this natural process. Sundials around which shadows would move, hourglasses down which sand would pour. For most people, the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars provided the only clocks they needed. Life was, in the words of the French medievalist Jacques Le Goff, dominated by agrarian rhythms, free of haste, careless of exactitude, unconcerned by productivity," end quote. This pre-modern understanding of time involved an organic sense of identity tied to a broader cosmos, free from the primary medium of human control. But like most technologies, Carr writes, the mechanical clock changed the way we saw ourselves. And like the map, it changed the way we thought. The mechanical clock moved from an instrument by which we measure time to a tool that measures productivity, which then measures the value of the producer, the very self. Charles Taylor, in A Secular Age, describes the way our social and cosmic imaginaries have shifted from the medieval to modern periods, particularly in relation to time. Recognizing distinctions between what he describes as ordinary time on the one hand and higher times, or eternity, on the other, the ancient and medieval concept of eternity offers opportunities to recalibrate our sense of ordinary time and our daily mundane activity. Eternity measures time as opposed to the modern tendency to measure time according to its hourly, daily, yearly, and calendar events associated with productivity. The modern concept of time tempts us to focus on time as part, division, or specialization, as opposed to time as duration or whole. Taylor engages St. Augustine by reframing our temporal understanding of eternity as gathered time. Augustine reflects on his own self-identity as a journey and his communion on that journey through fellowship or union with God. Explaining his own sense of fragmentation and multiplicity in terms of desire, Augustine accounts for the one God by whom he is apprehended, gathered, and unified. He writes, quote, "But now my years pass in groans, and you, Lord, are my consolation. You are my eternal Father, but I am scattered in times whose order I do not understand. The storms of incoherent events tear to pieces my thoughts, the inmost entrails of my soul, until that day when, purified and molten by the fire of your love, I flow together to merge into you," end quote. Seeking to know God in time, while also directing his thoughts and actions toward eternity as time's final goal or end, he understands the linear movement of his life as inextricably tied to God, who will even continue his life after death. The theme of life as journey is one integral to his many works including his famous Confessions, City of God, and to some degree, his exploration on the mysteries of the Trinity and De Trinitate. In the Confessions, Augustine gives his more personal account of this experience, reflecting on his own physical, psychological, and spiritual development from infancy to early childhood, adolescence, youth, and mature adulthood that involves the search for truth, identity, and belonging. In fact, Augustine opens the Confessions describing a fundamental restlessness, even fragmentation, in which he seeks a sense of wholeness. Such seeking drives humans forward in the search for true rest throughout life's journey, from his perspective. In De Doctrina Christiana, translated on Christian teaching, Augustine describes the Christian experience as one in which we are travelers away from our homeland. He says, quote, "So in this mortal life, we are like travelers away from our Lord. If we wish to return to the homeland where we can be happy, we must use this world, not enjoy it, in order to discern the invisible attributes of God, which are understood through what has been made, or, in the other words, to derive eternal and spiritual value from corporeal and temporal things." End quote. Augustine relates his order of love, in which we are to use or love all temporal things, as penultimate in relation to our ultimate eternal love for God as the destination and end of all love. Augustine believes we often confuse and disorder temporal and eternal loves, tending to grasp on to our existence in time as if it were ultimate. In response, Augustine accounts for the Creator's gracious posture toward creation by becoming creation itself that is subject to time and change. He says, quote, "Christ, who chose to offer himself not only as a possession for those who come to their journey's end, but also as a road, chose to become flesh," end quote. In becoming flesh, the God-man Jesus Christ offers a new road or path by which the eternal and temporal are joined, leading creatures back to the ultimate eternal goal. Augustine's commentary on Genesis offers an allegorical interpretation of the 7 days of creation, comparing them to the 7 epochs of history, as well as the 7 stages of life. While Augustine initially describes aging and death as negative, relating to sin and the disastrous consequences of turning away from God, accounted for in the fall from grace, he later offers a more positive role for aging among the Christian community, as seen in this particular allegorical interpretation. The 6 stages include infancy, childhood, adolescence, youth as the prime of life, maturity or productivity, and old age. The 6th stage of old age turns into the 7th stage as Sabbath rest, where there is morning but no evening, here representing eternity. While Augustine acknowledges the challenge associated with old age as beings moving toward death and decay that are outwardly wasting away, he also accounts for spiritual ways elders are being renewed day by day. Moreover, he most poignantly identifies old age as the new man or new human, intent on spiritual understanding. Herein, older men and women contemplate the wisdom of God in union with Christ while enacting the virtues of justice and love. Closer to the journey's end, older individuals might demonstrate keener spiritual vision and witness to eternal realities among the intergenerational Christian community. Augustine offers an example through the life of Simeon in the Gospel of Luke, saying, quote, "The clearest testimony is given in the words of the venerable old man Simeon, who took the infant Christ into his arms and said, Now, Lord, you are releasing your servant in peace, according to your promise, because my eyes have seen your salvation, end quote. Here, Simeon's spiritual sight led his physical sight, while witnessing to multiple generations within his religious community and beyond through the account of Scripture. The aged, and from this perspective, become signs pointing to the eternal Sabbath rest through this renewed vision and focus. Augustine's focus on Sabbath rest as the temporal journey's fulfillment in eternity is powerful. He concludes his confession saying, quote, "The seventh day has no evening and no ending. After our works, which, because they are your gift to us, are very good, we also may rest in you for the Sabbath of eternal life," end quote. Likewise, Augustine concludes his City of God, describing Sabbath rest as the culmination of the 7 epochs in history, saying, quote, "After this present age, God will rest as the culmination, after this present age, God will rest, as it were, on the 7th day, and he will cause us, who are the 7th day, to find our rest in him," end quote. Thus, the journey moves teleologically or purposefully towards Sabbath rest, the journey's end in eternity. Elderhood, or the aged stage of life, holds a privileged position in its experience through time and its proximity to eternity for Augustine. A physical representation of this journey through time might be portrayed in the image of the labyrinth circle, which I am now going to share my screen with you and show you for a moment. If I can do this. This is actually a labyrinth circle that we have at my institution at Merrimack College in North Andover, Massachusetts. And here you will see my students on the labyrinth modeled after Chartres Cathedral. So labyrinth pilgrimages were utilized around Europe in the Middle Ages, perhaps the most famous one still remaining at Chartres Cathedral in France. Labyrinths can demonstrate the wisdom found in an Augustinian spirituality, particularly in its focus on reflection, as well as the role of time circumscribed by eternity. The labyrinth serves as a physical symbol of a pilgrim spirituality, which is central to Augustine's many works. Unlike a maze, a labyrinth involves a forged path in which pilgrims move along its many circuits or turn toward the center. The 6 central petals, as you can see here in the middle of the labyrinth, may symbolize for Augustine the 6 days of creation, the 6 stages of history, or 6 stages of life, with the 6th day of old age moving into the center, here symbolized as eternity or union with God. In the labyrinth, one can recognize that time always exists in relation to eternity. Eternity measures time. Taking each step forward involves a linear progression, what we might call moments, segments, or parts, that is somehow tied to the broader whole, even when that whole is yet to be seen or comprehended. Pilgrims of all ages, young, old, middle-aged, are invited to walk the labyrinth for personal and spiritual meditation on life's journey. This poses a second point for reflection in relation to time, that of belonging through communion with God and others, along with the possibilities for virtue. So I will stop sharing my screen and go back to, now we'll head into my second point. Belonging and communion and the possibilities for virtue. The journey through time is one of purpose and meaning for Augustine. Integral to this idea is the issue of belonging for aging. Much like Nicholas Carr, geriatrician Louise Aronson also recognizes ways in which our metaphors and tools impact the way we perceive ourselves in society. Aronson writes on the shift in perspectives, critiquing ways in which old age became medicalized as a problem in the 20th century. Aronson says, quote, "In the late 19th century, when Americans began viewing the body as a machine and not a divine gift, their sense of old age changed too, in ways that encouraged looking over noticing. Having previously seen old age or old people as closer to God, Americans now saw them through an industrial lens, lacking function and efficiency. Old age began to seem less than compared with youth, and aging came to be associated with decline and obsolescence, conditions people distance themselves from even today, invoking that same singular mechanistic definition of human worth." The trouble with the mechanistic definition of worth is its reduction to dissecting time in terms of segments, not to mention superimposing evaluations typically used for inanimate objects onto organic life. Much like the use of the mechanical clock, the mechanistic analogy reduces the aging person to an object, thing, or part defined by a particular moment. In contrast, an Augustinian perspective shifts the lens from one of object to subject, part to whole, time to eternity. Rather than discard elders through a mechanistic gaze that derives value from productivity, instead, an Augustinian vision sees value in Sabbath rest that moves from the beginning to the end of the human lifespan and then beyond. The biblical narrative shaping Augustine's imagination begins with the primordial garden and creation and moves to a unified city of God in eternity. Imaging a God who rests in creation and rests in the Sabbath of eternity, elders reflect a special place in the intergenerational, social, and religious community. Belief shapes practice, and practice shapes belief. Engaging religious and specifically Christian theological approaches to aging challenges our functional understanding of worth, assigning value and belonging to all human creatures across the life spectrum, including those in the frailest phase of the aging experience. Here, value is derived and deemed good in its status as creature. Life is a gift to be received rather than a mechanistic product to achieve. Augustine's writings reflect deeply the value extended to creatures through divine gift or grace. Departing from the Stoics, who believed virtue could be achieved through human effort, or Pelagius, who argued creatures could achieve the law by human merit, Augustine argues life, virtue, salvation, and the good in each stage, young, middle, and old, is dependent on grace. In this dependence, each creature belongs. Augustine cannot describe his own life journey throughout his confessions, apart from recognizing divine presence, relationship, participation, and communion with God. In doing so, Augustine reflects belonging for all creatures, particularly those who are aging. Oxford professor C.S. Lewis describes the significance of belonging embedded within a teleological framework in his essay, Membership, later compiled in The Weight of Glory. Critiquing both 20th century individualism, in which autonomy achieves identity, and collectivism, in which identity is subsumed in the group whole, he argues instead that both personality and identity are fulfilled through belonging to God and community. In belonging, the self becomes more full, not less. Lewis says, quote, "The value of the individual does not lie in him. He is capable of receiving value. He receives it by union with Christ," end quote. Through union with the Creator, who became creature, the eternal who entered time in Jesus Christ, creatures now know the presence of and dependence on the Creator and fellowship with others through communion. This belonging is more than natural friendship, that for Aristotle could wax and wane, depending on the friend's virtue or good qualities that may be lost, particularly in old age. Ethicist Gilbert Meilander offers a helpful theological corrective that grounds friendship in fidelity and agape, as opposed to interest alone, those eternal virtuous qualities that sustain friendship regardless of the capabilities that come and go. Here, friendship hangs on the wholeness of the relationship rather than a particular moment of one's perceived capabilities. Such friendship reflects communion in what Lewis describes as the mystical body. Augustine describes the same mystical body as the totus Christus, in which Christ serves as head, and its many members compose the body. Offering an interesting interpretation of Genesis 1 in the Confessions, Augustine recognizes the eternal Son as head that predestines and brings to life not only creation, but also the church as body through time. Much like the patient is a whole person in which all parts make one, so too does an Augustinian theology show the church as the whole body in which all its parts, young, old, infant, frail, disabled, and able-bodied, belong together, not only in time, but also in eternity as gathered time. With Christ as head, eternal and temporal goals align in works of love within the body. More than friendship, the Christian body is unified through belonging in corporeal, communal, and familial ways that are future directed and hopeful in the midst of life's journey through both peace and hardship. Theologian Karl Barth explains that the young, middle-aged, and old need one another in interdependent relationships to offer virtues. The young, novelty, the middle-aged, responsibility through work, and the old, wisdom to help combat the vices prone to each stage, including irresponsibility, prideful arrogance, or self-defeat. Not only does God rest in creation to disrupt the rhythms of work and time with a prayerful vision of eternity, but also certain stages of life, such as, and I quote Bart here, the supposed useless old granny, end quote, might demonstrate a keener sense of internal reflection and prayer as witness and service to the broader church in this eternal vision. Such belonging and communion is significant in growing virtues for aging elders and their role in building the body of Christ. There are 4 particular virtues necessary for the relation to time and their grounding in eternity to provide encouragement for the broader church as a whole: humility, wisdom, fortitude, and hope. First, humility. While on the face of things, love appears to be the primary virtue for Augustine, love must be rooted in the virtue of humility. In turning to the person experiencing old age, humility will remain paramount for situating the creature in relation to the Creator, as well as one's broader communal relations. Lisa Fulham describes humility from a Thomist perspective, saying, quote, "The core of humility is self-knowledge, acquired by turning one's attention outside the self. We learn who we are, and we learn our place by other-centeredness, a kind of cultivated moral attentiveness, end quote. However, advocating humility should not entail self-denigrating or oppressive views of the self. Instead, finding one's identity in the divine life helps offer an ordered love of self and neighbor that moves toward fulfillment. William F. May writes on the particular resonance humility holds for elders. May says, quote, "It can be considerably more uncomfortable to receive than to give. The virtue of humility necessary to receivers in human life does not come easily, especially to Americans, or we might say those in a capitalistic global economy, who take pride in their independence and their giving. Yet the progressive loss of friends, job, bodily prowess, and energy, the passing look on the face of the young that tells us we are old, these experience assault one's dignity. They humiliate. All the care in the world will not overcome the sting of humiliation. Only humility can," end quote. Recognizing the challenges of aging in a culture that values productivity, May reminds elders to remember the root definition behind the term human, or humus, which means from the earth. Turning away from the idol of productivity and self-determination as the highest value and moving toward a receptive posture in relation to God and neighbor is integral for the virtue of humility, not only through the life stages as a whole, but also the aging experience in its frailer dimensions. By humility, one knows when best to act and when best to lay down. This can be seen through the humble disposition that knows when to give and when to receive, when to continue, or when to relinquish or move toward more shared decision-making models, which is also tied to the virtue of wisdom or prudence in practical decision-making. So second, wisdom is tied to understanding or knowledge of God for Augustine. Wisdom comes from union with Christ or participation in the divine life that informs and orders life and time. Moreover, with Aristotle, wisdom embodies the capacity for developmental progression gained through experience over time. In the 7 stages, Augustine recognizes the wisdom that accrues through each stage of life, experience, and the proximate nearness to the end of life. Thus, elders hold an important particular role for discipleship, mentoring, and teaching the young and middle-aged. Wisdom comes from recognizing the good in life's limits. Virtue is the wisdom to act in the face of some limitation. In a postmodern, technology-driven society with seemingly limitless options for young people through digital devices, elders have much to offer with their recognition of the good in circumscribed freedoms that value commitments made through education, hard work, personal relationships, jobs, or even the good in child rearing. Elders can ground both the middle-aged and young in a world that seems increasingly chaotic, disembodied, and abstract. In addition, wisdom also includes practical wisdom or prudence. James Keenan says, prudence involves at least 3 qualities that include 1, knowing who we are as individuals, 2, where our limits and strengths lie, and 3, the ability to see the virtues where we need to grow as forms of self-reflection. May describes wisdom as openness to the past, present, and future. Sensitive to duration, wisdom might also bring forward historical memory in service to the church and broader society. One example might come from Barth recalling the atrocities of Nazi Germany in his writings on the ethics of euthanasia. Recalling the work of Barth, Bonhoeffer, and the Confessing Church is also significant in the midst of growing populist and authoritarian political ideologies in the United States and to some degree around the globe. In the midst of grave political and social unrest, the old and young need a fresh gospel lens that cuts through political ideologies while seeking intergenerational sanctification through historical insight, listening, truth-telling, and compassion, in considering how the church as body of Christ might relate to justice and the broader common good. Third, The virtue of fortitude or courage is significant for the aging experience. For Augustine, the natural virtues such as fortitude are all forms of love in relation to objects on the journey through time. Temperance helps individuals not to love objects too much, while fortitude helps individuals to bear the loss of temporal goods when they occur. Here, Augustine describes how individuals should be willing to bear all things for the sake of loving God. Rather than view fortitude solely in terms of courage or bravery, fortitude is also endurance through time. Like Augustine, Aquinas reflects on fortitude as facing fear or loss of some temporal or bodily good with courage. For many reasons, fortitude is an important virtue for those enduring aging. Aging involves much change to one's body in terms of physical and mental capacities, as well as change involving an individual's surrounding community. The virtue of fortitude will prove to be of particular importance for attaching oneself to something unchanging or eternal in the midst of change. For Augustine, union with Christ is the ultimate vision of love. By receiving and attaching oneself to Christ in love, one orders or endures these changes with more buoyancy. In fact, May lists courage as the primary virtue for this phase of life. Drawing insight from Aquinas, May says, quote, "Courage ranks first on the list of virtues. Westerners too often restrict this virtue to the battlefield. But the soldier's prospect of death is uncertain, his separation from his loved ones but temporary. Not so for the aged, who face the certainty of imminent death and whose losses are anything but temporary. That firmness may show itself far from the battlefield. An 80-year-old unmarried woman faces resolutely her declining years. A widower suddenly takes his first steps alone after 50 years of marriage. An aged mother finds her children too busy to have her around. Here, May offers an account in which elders encounter real and actual loss, as opposed to the soldier who faces the prospect of loss. Citing these personal challenges, May recognizes courage is not the absence of fear, but facing fear for the sake of a greater good. This sense of fortitude might encourage seniors to simplify and even reevaluate their attachment to unnecessary worldly goods as they move toward the end of their journey in time. In addition, endurance might also include long suffering through acute and even chronic pain. Here, W.H. Vanstone helps illuminate a posture of waiting found in the person of Christ, who demonstrates dignity for all conditions of life, including those frailer stages that involve waiting, passivity, responsiveness, and even suffering. Through a posture of waiting in love and grace, elders still hold meaning while enduring life's more arduous circumstances, endurance that looks and leads to hope. Fourth and finally, hope. Perhaps the virtue of fortitude naturally coheres or complements the virtue of hope. Hope is the realistic virtue for the pilgrim in time. For Augustine, hope looks toward union with the object of love that still remains beyond reach. Hope is distinctly tied to the anticipation of Sabbath rest in eternity. At rest, desire will no longer be fractured in the matrix of subordinate temporal goods. Instead, the fullness of desire will be achieved in perfect love and union with God. Such hope promises to fulfill not only desire, but also to transform the corruptible material body into that which is incorruptible or resurrected. By love, eternity measures time. Hope anticipates, even longs for, such eternal completion. Much like the Eucharist, or communion, that simultaneously looks backward to the cross and forward to Christ's return through memory and anticipation. Aging persons serve as signs of the vocation found in eternal Sabbath rest. This is the opposite of a mechanistic social imaginary measured by the mechanical clock. Instead, an eternal cosmological imaginary redefines value by pointing to completion through Sabbath rest that unites elders and the body of Christ as a whole. While these virtues do not promise an easy aging experience or an easy death, they do offer meaning for the whole person and the whole body of Christ through belonging and communion with God and others through life's journey with the goal of eternity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Autumn. That was a really interesting, fascinating, stimulating paper. And we've got some time now for questions. If anybody has questions, you can indicate to ask a question by using the raising hand function, which you will find either as a reactions button at the bottom or on some versions, I think, under the participants button at the bottom of your screen, or you can put a question in the chat and we will pick that up. So I will obviously pick up questions as people want them and read them out. So do we have any questions? Steve, I can see you there. You've got your hand raised.
Hi, Autumn. Thank you very much for that paper. It raises a lot of interesting questions and points for reflection. I appreciated your critique of the idea of mechanism and the way that that impacts valuation of human life. But I wondered about the other set of linguistic tools that are being used in this discussion and their utility, particularly the precise language of value and worth. Has this language itself become too entangled with the capitalist systems that you mentioned? Is value the right kind of language for us to continue using as we consider the human person through time?
That's an excellent question, one I hadn't reflected on. In many ways, we are a product of our cultural and social matrix, and so even bringing up this linguistic use of the word value and worth, certainly the way we use value, I think of even at institutions, which still, my institution that privileges this productivity. We always say value added, right? And that sense of value has a sense of, is it a capitalistic word shaped by the systems that we culturally are maybe located? Meaning, purpose, I don't know if you think these terms get us outside of that, but even as you mentioned, our words certainly fall short. That said, I'm looking for ways in which we can challenge the narrative or our particular cultural lens, whether it's mechanistic vision, as I used, or productivity, to say what are the narratives that reshape our identity from practices, from a religious sense, or whether that's pre-modern or other cross-cultural ways, as was mentioned earlier in the session, I think it was Christine Lai, from an Eastern perspective, right, that might have more of an eternal vision or a way in which it isn't the same that's been looked at in the West with this more productive model, which is aging is in some ways more denigrated, perhaps. So that's a really good question and one I'll keep reflecting on. Do you have any thoughts of your own that you could add?
I just wonder, I don't really have a proposal, just wondering if this is one of those moments where ressourcement might take us back to the early sources and see what kinds of other tools were being used to talk about human life that we might be able to reappropriate for today.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can see there are one or two more hands up, but I'm going to take a question first from the chat from Neil, who says, thank you. I wonder how this helps us understand the impacts of dementia on both the older person and those journeying with the older person.
Excellent question. I think John Swinton has written a wonderful book on dementia and being remembered and the memory of God, right? And he challenges certainly and uses this, he challenges our vision of autonomy and how self-determination culturally is problematic in the ways in which, again, I'm using the term value, but the meaning, we might say, of those experiencing dementia. So again, it's how do we reshape the narrative in which we are located, in which all persons belong, and those with dementia. Here, memory is going to play a role for identity for Augustine. And there's a way I think John Swinton, helps us shift that we exist in the memory of God, whether we have the capacity for memory at the moment or not, as well as a really relational or participation understanding of the self in which we always exist in relation to God and others. So that would be my response at this moment. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to go to David now. I can see you've got your hand up there, David.
Thank you. Just picking up on Steve's question about the language value and worth. Mm-hmm. My source I'm going to quote is Oscar Wilde, who defined a cynic as somebody who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And the source of our value or the scale, I'm not prepared to give it up to the commercial definitions, because one of the things that's certainly evident in the COVID times is the value of frontline workers and the value of care assistants, but they're not paid a price that has a commercial representation of that value. And so our circumstances, and I think therefore to preserve the language of experience and the historical narrative, well, even in the biblical definitions of value and worth, and as God's judgment or assessment rather than human relative systems. Because one of the areas where I learn it from, I work with adults with intellectual disability. And so they're defined by their disability or by the syndrome they have. But when you're actually working on the floor, their disability becomes irrelevant. You're working with their abilities. And we had an experience of that in Ireland when the first Olympic Games for people with disabilities showed people competing and functioning within the realms of their experience and the limits of their experience, but to the highest level of their ability. So I don't think we should concede. I think it's, in fact, time into the public square. It's now is our time to assert the scriptural set of values and worth as being relationally relevant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. A question in the chat from Mai Yuk. How could we encourage the older generation to engage with, in brackets, accept children and families as part of the congregation?
Great question. There's a lot of intergenerational work to be done. And of course, it depends on context. Whether that, I find much value, actually, that the young need the old, and a beauty in the relationship of the old and the young. So whether that's the grandparent relationship and family units, but certainly in churches, I think that there's a beauty in older generation teaching the younger generation. I can think of that in my own congregational experience. The significance of they have multiple, I would use it, grandparents and relationships with people in our congregation who taught them in classes. So I think that's important. Whether that's important, and you have to also bridge preferences in terms of, right, each parish, each congregation can be unique and have its own particular idiosyncrasies, depending on if there is tension between preferences and what's wanted, but a more inviting and welcoming, and even whether it's programs that you link children with adults, I think is something that can continue to be cultivated. Not to mention the role of godparents and hearing from different, I would call it social locations of individuals, older individuals within the church is also very significant. Exposing young people to multiple experiences of the older generation in congregations and parishes. I don't know if I responded well to that particular question. And again, it might be the dynamic of the particular parish. Do you want to add to that, who asked that question? Or have a particular tension in mind?
Yeah, just the situation like some of the older generation in our congregation, like for example on Sunday service, they still very focused on the Sunday service, and then they will expect children, if they are in the Sunday service, they have to be quiet.
Yes.
And sit down still and listen to whatever the adult is doing. You should do the same thing. But for us, of course, as a worker, we will understand that we can't expect children to sit an hour the same as an adult. And we more emphasize on the intergeneration interaction and learning at the same time. So we have other events like Messy Church to have different generation mingle together. But still there's, if some of the elderly, if they go to the message church, they understand what's going on and they find that, oh yeah, we can have different alternatives to cater for children and young people and the whole family. But there are still some of them a bit more kind of stubborn. They don't accept any difference. So if children are at the service, they have to be quiet and sit down and behave, something like that. Yeah.
Yes, obviously in each situation it's unique and different, and there's a component of whether it's separate programming but a welcoming environment that takes from the leadership down that says we joyfully hear the sounds of children, and kind of acknowledging that can be beneficial. And I think you highlight an important component. I'm gonna get to other questions, but just that I don't want to imply that being aged or going through the aging experience necessarily only implies virtue. There's also capacity for vice, which is when I got into that intergenerational dynamic of listening, a desire for interaction between the multiple generations. So there has to be a willingness of that sort of humility actually is also very helpful for grounding and the listening to wisdom that can come from, again, cross generations. So thank you for that. Are there other questions? I don't want to.
Yes, there are a couple of other questions in the chat. One from Colleen. Have you considered Pannenberg's theology on God drawing us forward into the future?
I have not, but that's an excellent reference and one for me to consider. So I appreciate that, raising that question.
Great, thank you. And then from Andy, how do we change people's perception of time and usefulness when the idea of needing to be productive is so deeply ingrained in our society?
It's a great question. So pragmatically, how does this look? Well, we're all, many of us, right, to be employed, there's certain demands. And even I can see on higher education, right, how productivity, that model is, right, impacting. So as well as the church to some degree, right, whether how we quantify or place value on what's being accomplished. So I think it's reminding ourselves, right, the weekly habits we have, reminding ourselves of this counter narrative. This is where Sabbath actually is an actual weekly practice is really significant. Whether that's one taking a literal 24 hours, but having certain practices in which, whether it's we turn off the technology and we walk away from work, or having that rhythm in the day, whether that's the whatever time with one's family between 5 and 8 p.m. or whatever choices we make, the kind of creating a rhythm, going outside, the walking away from what is called the immediate demands, which have become only, I mean, technology has become my other research interest, is only becoming more and more, I would say, quantified, given that tech allows us to work everywhere and all the time. So I think we have to be more intentional about boundaries, more intentional about the sense of time having a fullness, and what in our relationships, whether that's over the meal, which is a picture at some level of like pointing to Eucharist, which is pointing, right? Ways in which, when can we have time full or gathered time experiences that, again, rhythms we create that are reminding us as a kind of counter narrative. That's my best, what I would offer at this moment. But it's also, that is going to hopefully encourage a more, if we can, to some degree, the church being, as that comment was made by our friend from Ireland earlier, being really counter narrative that helps to push our social awareness of disrupting really what is our system, our ways of thinking.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Peter, I can see you've got your hand up there.
Thanks very much, Richard, and Autumn, thanks ever so much for your paper, which I found really stimulating. I just wanted to ask you about a particular sort of contrast I've got in mind, and whether you think there's any merit in it. Whether you think there's any merit in making a distinction between learning about aging and learning from aging. And I just wondered if, one way to characterize your paper would be that you've kind of introduced us really kind of helpfully to kind of narratives supporting certain sorts of virtues in getting us to think about aging differently. And although I think you did touch about from aging, whether there is a kind of a discussion still to be had about what we might learn from the process, so not simply about the orientation towards aging, but what might be learnt from it, so to speak. I mean, what might we learn about being creatures or some such from aging? And then, as a kind of supplementary question, I wondered if you thought there was anything that human beings might learn from the aging of non-human creatures. So we're in a wider context of aging, so to speak, and whether that might be a kind of reminder to us of our own aging, which of course raises the kind of really interesting question about what Sabbath rest might mean for creatures other than humans.
Great questions, thank you. Yes, I am certainly taken by the first question, the difference between learning about aging and from aging, both in terms of method. So a colleague of mine that I would highlight, Sarah Moses, she wrote the book Ethics of the Elderly, and she is currently and has been involved for some time on what we might call more ethnographic, more on the ground interviewing. So more of the learning from the aging, the San Egidio community, different communities that we could highlight. My approach has, if you'd say, is more the learning about aging. I could give a backdrop of how I even became interested in this. Was when I was at the Bioethics Center at Yale, and it was around transhumanist challenges to aging. And it just really, I was around a lot Sherwin Newland, and I was around Dan Callahan and some others who've written on aging. And part of me in my gut said, the transhumanist challenge suggests there's something wrong with aging fundamentally. And I said, I know in the Christian tradition, there's this idea of sin and whatever, death, but there's got to be something positive. I mean, it just goes, so I wanted to go and call it about aging from the Christian sources. So you could say my approach is more in that vein of thinking. That said, I started that research in my 20s. I'm now 40, and I think I'm only going to keep growing, right, in my understanding of what this means, hopefully, if life continues, right? So, right, I think learning about it and from it, there's significance in both. About it is important for reframing, right, how we think culturally. From it is significant because those are the voices on the ground and ways in which I think the demographic, ethnographic approach is very significant. And there's lots of good work being done there, among others, and ones I hope to continue to learn from. And then your second comment about aging, among non-human creatures. I mean, part of the interest here is looking at finitude itself or limitation as a good. I found that even Barth and Augustine never want to say death itself was good, but finitude, the limit, was good. And you could see this as a creaturely reality in terms of non-human creation. Something about this process of the seasons even pointing to it, right? Opportunities for new life, but then there's an ending. So I think there's wisdom in that to be learned from the natural world. So thank you for that question. That was also a good one.
Thank you. We've got one final question here, which might be quite a good one as we're just approaching time, because it may be possible to give it a yes or no answer, but I'll leave that to you, Autumn. It says, hi, thanks for the lecture. Do you agree that, as Augustine describes Sabbath rest, that the divine gift can be accomplished at any age?
The divine gift. Yes, so one doesn't, So divine gift being one we experientially have in time, yes, in terms of grace and union with Christ. But at the same time, if you mean Sabbath rest, in that sense, old age is not something that is a necessary given, right? We can die, we're mortal at any time and at any stage. So certainly one can move into Sabbath rest, we could say, at any stage of life. And so our mortality is real, whether that's even an infant or young child, right? Or middle-aged or old age. So I wouldn't want to limit it to only being for those who are old and aged and among the aged seniors. That said, Augustine sets it up as kind of this life stage, and that's as in terms of anticipation as one looks forward to moving into life stage, if that so occurs. So I hope that does respond to that particular question. That's a good one. So in that sense, old age is a gift because it's not a foregone conclusion. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you again, Autumn, for your paper and for your responses to the questions and comments and engagement in the discussion. It's always stimulating to journey for any time with Augustine, and thank you for bringing that into the conversation. That's been really, really good. So it just remains for me to invite everybody to thank you before I hand over for directions for the final session. So thank you very much.